unlike the previous discussion, I would say my wife and I had complete control over our children and all the decisions they made.
Are we supposed to read the rest of your talk?
Okay. Thanks very much. It's always a pleasure to be here as the January professor of behavioral sciences. In evolution, I'm glad we have a great evolutionist here in Francisco. In evolutionary theory, a fundamental distinction that is made is between what are called ultimate and proximate behaviors, or I should say ultimate and proximate reasons for behaviors. So that word's actually wrong there. It really means explanations, and the ultimate explanations are the reasons why they originally arose. And the proximate ones are the functions they may be serving today, and those do not necessarily coincide. So for example, the initial reasons for the patterning that you see on shells like this may have been just some accident, including the coloration, just some odd byproduct. But once those are there, they provide the template for birds to find them, whatever. They become the template for the evolution of different kinds of adaptations. Similarly, in terms of the problem of aggregation is widespread in biology. This is the beginning of the cellular slime mold, and the initial reasons for aggregation in the cellular slime mold is just a bunch of cells that once there is a signal from cyclic AMP that's sent out begin to aggregate. Once they aggregate, they form slugs. Those slugs move along. They become organisms, basically. They stop at some point. They stand up. These are the sporulating cells, and these are the stalk cells. And in fact, this is one of the great problems in the social evolution of organisms, namely because these cells here don't reproduce. Why do they do that? Why do they join this aggregation? This is an aggregation in which individuals have to give up their own fitness in order to join the group. But my point here is that the initial explanation of how aggregation gets started is quite separate from the adaptive behavior that builds upon that aggregation. If I turn to what Larry Iannacone said in his scheme, the question I had was, could the spatial heterogeneity that one saw in the distribution of sacred places and the local dominance that arises there then ultimately lead to what an evolutionary biologist would think of as speciation, the emergence of distinct religious sects? He talked about the 12 tribes of Israel, which maintained the same basic religion, but the Sunnis and the Shiites, the separation into different sects. The initial separation into different geographic regions may not have involved a difference in philosophy, but once they became separated and isolated, compare that with allopatric speciation in population genetics and evolution. Once they're separated, that provides a mechanism that can allow other distinctions to arise. And so that one of the things I want to do today is to try to take apart the different stages that must go on in the creation of norms and religions, etc. Yet another example that's become a hot topic recently is, this is Bill Hamilton, who some of you probably knew, who addressed Darwin's great puzzle as to why it was that individuals cooperated, in particular the extreme forms of cooperation, altruism, eusociality that arise in the haplodiploid insects and, as has been realized since, in many other groups as well. Why do individuals, just like in the slime molds, give up their own fitness in order to join a collective in which they benefit somebody else? Why are they willing to do that? And there's been a lot of controversy about this topic since Darwin, but especially since Hamilton's paper, in which the strongest advocates on both sides have been Ed Wilson, who was argued most impressively in favor of this and most impressively against it. This recent paper by Martin Novak, Wilson, and Karina Tarnita, whom we've just hired at Princeton, basically makes the distinction between the two aspects of collective behavior. One is that individuals are aggregated into a group, and the other is there's something involving their high degree of relatedness. And Hamilton's theories were it was the high degree of relatedness that comes about through the haplodiploid insects, the bees, the ants, the wasps. When I say they're haplodiploid, that means the males come from unfertilized eggs, which leads to a higher genetic relatedness among individuals. And so that was his explanation, now debated. And that leads to the aggregation. And one of the arguments of this paper is, well, the aggregation comes first, and then that could occur even without the relatedness. But because they're in aggregates, they become more closely related. Whatever. I just want to point out the separation of these two aspects. So in the stages I want to distinguish in the formation of animal societies, whether human or otherwise, is first of all, there may be just these random associations at the beginning. Just could be due to turbulence in the marine spectrum, for example. And then, once that is there, there's the potential for that to be added to by active aggregation, in which individuals move or do things in ways that tend to associate them in the group. Maybe there's nothing more than imitation or attraction going on, but that can, as in this example, these are starlings. I've showed this here before. This is a wonderful movie that shows, except for this hawk. This is not a starling, this is a hawk. And this group is all moving in response to that hawk. And so individuals are doing nothing more, presumably, than moving in relation to each other, in relation to their positions, their velocities, and, of course, that hawk, which some of those individuals are responding to. And then we get these remarkable and dramatic aggregation as a result. So those are the first two steps. But once those groups are formed, under some circumstances, we get territorial behavior, whether it's in humans or others, like these elephant seals, in which there's stabilization of group boundaries. And we heard some discussion of that before about taking your children to certain synagogues or churches, or sending them to school districts, or doing other things to influence their behavior, whether it's intentional or not. And then, once we have that stabilization, we get customs that are enforced there, norms, laws, and enforcement of those that stabilizes them even further. And finally, built on that, institutions, religions, societies. So these are all different stages, and they're not clean cut, obviously, but I want to distinguish them. So getting back to the question of aggregation, the simplest models of aggregation in this spatial stochastic process literature, one talks about the voter model. In physics, it's the Ising model, and for magnetization. And the question is, do you get consensus forming, where there's nothing much going on here except individuals imitate their neighbors. And in the voter model, what you do is you select a random neighbor and you adopt that neighbor's opinion. And with two opinions and a two-dimensional grid, or one-dimensional, you would always get consensus. But in higher dimensions, you may not. A somewhat different model that will be familiar to many of you is Tom Schelling's famous model of segregation, and how groups who just don't want to be isolated from others of their type will move to those neighborhoods, and that can result in the separation into societies. And the voter model can be extended to multi-type voter models, many different types, and I'll talk briefly about various extensions of it. So the voter model, you choose a random neighbor. The majority voter model is similar, but instead you census all of your neighbors and go with the majority. So you can see there's a difference between the stochastic model and the deterministic model. It's very similar, except this is more deterministic. And again, you can ask, is there consensus? How long does it take? And a variant on this is the threshold voter model, in which you don't take 50%, but you switch to you census all of your neighbors, and if they're above some threshold, you adopt that. So Rick Durrett and I, some years ago, we actually never published this, but Paul Ehrlich and I discuss it in a paper we published, in which we looked at these dynamics for different thresholds. So look in the upper left, first of all. If you have a low threshold, that means you're changing your opinions all the time. We start with a random distribution of individuals. You're changing your opinion all the time. And if you're changing your opinion all the time, you never form any pattern. Now, if you look to the right, nothing much is going to happen. I've actually put this on to click twice, but you'll never see anything unless you're really sharp, you'll see some slight changes. There, you saw a slight change. That's it. So the left and the right look the same, but this is a very high threshold. You never change your opinion. So dynamically, they're very different, but the static pattern's the same. But now, if you put an intermediate threshold somewhere around 50%, you get a very different kind of picture going on. So these models are very rich, and here you can get these clusters and the Schelling type patterns finding. There are a number of extensions to this that we've looked at. One of them are nonlinear voter models in which your probability, and I'll come back to talk about things that utilize this in a minute. You don't just pick the number of neighbors, but there's some nonlinear dependence and a probability of switching depending on the number of your neighbors that have the opposite opinion. There are more complex networks that you can look at in higher dimensions, more complex topologies. And another problem of interest is, can you, as Herb was talking about before, Rick Durrett and I looked at this 15 years ago, what's the right way to write a diffusion approximation, a continuous approximation, to describe these dynamics? And for those interested in more recently, Durrett, together with two collaborators, has looked at some of these nonlinear extensions. This is a paper that just came out this year, and reaction to fusion equations. So this is kind of a review in here that I'm not involved with. And then there are more interesting, more novel extensions, like beginning to put payoff functions on top of this. This is all imitation. But as I talked about the different stages, you can put payoff functions. You can look at large populations and look at more complicated continuous dependence on frequency of types. Start to put in normative behaviors, to which I'll come a little bit more in a moment, and more complex and even variable topologies that change in relationship to what individuals are doing. You make or break links. So I'll talk about all of those things. Now some of these things I'd like to illustrate with some modeling work done with two postdocs, or actually one was a graduate student at the time, Alessandro Tovoni and Maya Schluter. Alessandro was a graduate student in economics in Venice rather. I get those places confused. You use too many of the same letters. On how norms can develop in cooperation through ostracism or some other penalty function. When you're, for example, using a common pool resource such as groundwater. The idea is there's a certain dynamic of the resource which is extracted by individuals, but individuals extract at different rates. There are some who are interested in preserving the stock, so they extract at a low rate, and then there are selfish individuals who extract at a high rate. So we have these two kinds of agents. These are the cooperators, these are the defectors. The cooperators get this payoff pi sub c, depending on their effort and the resource level. The defectors get a different payoff, a higher payoff, but then they're penalized. They're penalized by this ostracism function, and the important term here is omega of FC. FC is the frequency of cooperators, so the more, and it's a nonlinear dependence, the more cooperators there are, the higher the penalty. So if there are very few cooperators, there's not much that's going on, but as the number of cooperators goes up, this becomes a more effective penalty, and this is what the ostracism function looks like in our model. And we look at replicator dynamics to see who wins out. There are two key parameters in this. One of them is what we call the effort multiplier, which is mainly if I'm the nice, if I'm the nice guy and Herb's not, mu is the number, the ratio of what he extracts from the system relative to what I extract from the system. Okay, so it's the effort multiplier between the defector and cooperator, and the other thing is what the frequency of cooperators are. So those are that's not really a parameter, that's a dynamic variable. But if I look at the outcome as a function of both of those things, this is the phase diagram. This is the frequency of cooperators, and this is the mu, this is the selfishness level. And what you can see is there's a separatrix. If you get above this separatrix, you go to a mixed equilibrium. If you're below it, you go down and you get all defectors. So the cooperators have to get above a certain level, but if they do, they can establish this norm in the population. in which, in this model, they coexist with the defectors. So both exist, but the extraction level is lower than it would be. Now, I think this sort of model would carry over. I haven't tried to do it, but I was sitting back there as I listened to the other talks, changing my talk, and so this is very speculative. The previous speaker apologized for talking about published work. I try to talk about unpublishable work, and this would be an example. So I would think for religious group formation, ostracism for non-participants, we know that goes on, right? There's a threshold behavior when adherents exceed a critical level, and once you get there, you could get coexistence of adherents and heretics, and the heretics endure ostracism so that they can have freedom from religious norms. Now, I know this works. You just have to change the letters to A and H in the previous model, and it carries over. Okay. Now, how do social norms of this sort become established? When I first started coming here 4 years ago, I talked about a model that, and I want to specifically explore three things here. One, what the role of leadership is. Second, how is consensus achieved in democratic societies? And three, what's the role of the unopinionated, what we, for reasons that, for good reasons, called uninformed, but this has gotten us in a little trouble because the political scientists who read our paper think we mean it's good for people to be uninformed. We don't say that. But anyway, I'm going to use unopinionated and uninformed in more or less the same way here. So about 4 years ago, I talked about a model that Durrett and I had done, published in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, and it was built off of a model that Bob Axelrod had done, in which, in the simple version, the idea is individuals meet each other on some network. There's a focal individual, that's me, and that there's a neighbor that's Pete, and I bump into Pete on this network with a certain probability. We both have certain labels associated with us, what our religions are, what our ethnicity is, what our political party is, and I choose, what I'm really interested in are his attitudes and opinions and my own attitudes and opinions on various issues like abortion rights or stem cell research or gay marriage. And maybe I know what my opinion is on two of them, but not so sure on the third one. And so I ask him his opinion, and with a certain probability, I decide to adopt or not adopt his opinion. And that probability depends upon our similarity in these other traits, in the labels and in the traits. And then, on a slower time scale, I examine my own attitudes and opinions and compare them with the normative thing for my labels, and I decide whether to actually switch, for example, political parties, switch religion, based on the fact that I no longer agree with, my attitudes have changed enough that they deviate from it. So we have two time-scale processes going on here. And we call this, for obvious reasons, homophilous imitation. And what happens here is the group divides up into different clusters. And there's nothing going on here except imitation. That's the only thing that's here. It can lead to the formation of stable groups. And one of the things that happens is that opinions and attitudes on diverse issues may get bundled in as frozen accidents. So if you've ever wondered why is it that this political party has these attitudes and opinions and its platforms, and this political party, the others, I argue to some extent those are accidents of history. I mean, why is it, for example, that if you're a liberal like I am, then you think that all women's schools are good things and all male schools are bad things? I mean, there's an inconsistency there, right? But some of it comes about from the historical development of the issues and what was behind it and why we argued for those sorts of things. And we saw big flips, for example, in the politics in the US related to civil rights between 1948 and 1956. It used to be that the South was all Democratic, all the states were Democratic, and the Republican strongholds were elsewhere, like in the Northeast. And after the civil rights thing, that all flipped. And if you look at the maps in the elections about that time, you'll see that. So these things become bundled as frozen accidents. Once those groups are there, going back to what I said at the beginning, they can provide the template for collective benefits. And once those collective benefits are there, there's going to be selection for things for individuals to imitate each other, to make thresholds for not interacting with other groups, to protect those benefits. And there are other extensions that I won't talk about here to more complex webs of interaction, to asymmetric imitation. That model was just a pure imitation, but there are power structures, for example, that lead to asymmetry, and to payoffs, which aren't in that model at all. So the remaining questions I want to address in the time that's left is what the role of leadership is. What about the importance of the followers in this? It's not all about leaders. And in fact, should one leader follow? Let me start with the last question. So these are krill. These are pictures of krill that my student Danny Grunbaum did for his thesis. And this is to illustrate the idea that suppose this is a resource landscape, and I'm searching for food on that landscape. And there's more food here than here, but it would be even better to get here. So suppose I'm searching by just random search climbing gradients, resource gradients, and I start here, I'm going to end up here, and that's not bad, but it's not the best peak. And if I could share information with other individuals who happen to climb this peak, maybe we'd all be better off. So if everybody just gets their own information and leads for themselves, some individuals will end up at the high peak and some at the low peak. If everybody just follows everybody else, they'll all end up together, but nobody will know where the food is. So the optimal solution from the collective point of view is somewhere in between, some balanced, some leaders and followers, everybody doing a little information gain on their own, or some subset being leaders and others being followers. But that's not the way it works in most animal groups. There's nobody there giving directions, you do this, you do this. There are exceptions maybe in ant societies and things. It's more that it's a game theoretic situation in which everybody's out for themselves. And so, and I'll come back to this, one of the things we look at is how to apply game theoretic models to what the trade-offs are between leading and following, between information gain and imitating other individuals. Which should you do? What's the outcome going to be for the group? And my colleague and former postdoc, Ian Cousin, who has a very active lab, is able to, first of all, train individuals to targets by shining a laser to the target and then giving a reward. These are golden shiners, small fish. And then putting them together and then tracking them, as you can see here. Each individual is marked. And those individuals are going for the target, and you can track and see which individuals go for the target and know which ones are the leaders and which ones are the followers, or even if they don't know that. They're just following other individuals. There's nobody who says follow Sam, he's the one with the information. They're just following their neighbors. And so we've explored the evolutionary models. I took it out of the lecture at the last minute because it's a lot of math. And I'm happy to send you these papers, but basically what we do is we say, okay, suppose that you're alone and you're trying to go for a particular target. So if you want to gather information, you have to make an investment. That investment is costly. So ignoring the social dynamic, what's the optimal investment in gathering information to make? That turns out to be a fairly straightforward problem. Then we ask the collective problem. Okay, now you're sitting in a collective. You can also imitate, no cost, you can imitate your neighbors. And now put that all together in a stochastic dynamic model and optimize and find out the game theoretic solution. Because we put types in competition, we can make some analytical computations. And these two papers in PNAS, I'm not involved with this one, but Ian's on both of them, actually explore that. I don't want to talk about that. Well, I do want to talk about it. I don't have time to talk about it today. But I want to talk about extending something I've talked about here before, here in this room, but most of you have not been here, on the trade-offs between leaders and followers. And this began with a paper that Ian and I published together with some collaborators in Nature in 2005. And it was based on a model for which the original ideas were Ian's, in which fish, but you can think about this as individuals in a society making decisions. This happens to be fish moving. Everybody's got their own velocity, everybody's got their, well, not everybody necessarily, but let's start with everybody's got their own G vector, which is their idea of where they ought to go, where the food is, and their own D, which is the set of distances to nearest neighbors. So everybody moves, and this is an individual-based stochastic model, everybody moves either by going towards where they think the target is for whatever reasons. Doesn't have to be right. You can think about this as a political leader deciding to go to war. It's only that this individual has an opinion, and it's a strong opinion. So everybody's got their own vector, and indeed the way they trade these off, so they call this one the trendsetter and this one the copier, the way they trade this off is that at each time step they update their vector positions according to the social vector and their own intrinsic knowledge vector normalized with a weighting function omega, and that's going to be crucial in the rest of the lecture, with a weighting function that says how much they rely on their own opinion. So if omega is 0, then all you're doing is following. And I'm not going into details on this vector, but it's some combination of the average of your neighbor's positions and velocities. And there's a lot of work going on to see what cues individuals really do respond to in fish schools and bird flocks, etc. Some of which I'll show you later. If omega is virtually infinite, then all you do is do what you think you should do, and you don't pay attention to anybody else. But in most of what I'm going to show you, everybody's got, nobody's got an infinite omega. Everybody pays attention to their neighbors a little bit. And some of what we've done, the omega is adaptive, meaning if I think I ought to be going this way, if I'm really strongly stubborn, but nobody's paying attention to me, at some point I weaken omega and start paying attention to others. So we look at all those situations, not all of which I can, of course, tell you about. So I'm going to show you some simulations in which initially there are 100 individuals, and everybody, in the first one there's only going to be one individual who's got any information, only one who's got an omega that's not 0. That's that white dot there, and that white dot thinks it ought to go here, and the other 99 don't have any idea where this is going. They're not opinionated. They're just moving around, but there's so much inertia there that the white dot keeps getting pulled back in because his omega is not infinite, and the group really doesn't do anything. But if you change that 1 to 5 individuals who want to go there, they find their way to the front and then pull that along. And if you change the 5 to 10, the group moves rather effortlessly up to the front. Now if you look at how effectively it moves to the front as a function of the proportion of informed individuals, and these are for groups of different sizes, you'll see that it rather quickly gets up to maximal. In fact, if you look instead of the proportion at the number of informed individuals, then by the time you get up to 5 or 10 individuals, the group moves about as effectively as it can up to the front. So a small number of leaders can take this whole group there. It's assuming all the leaders want to go the same direction. But what if they don't? What if there are 2 directions and there's some difference in preference? So 5 of them want to go here, 5 want to go here, and the other 90 are followers. Well, initially they split the difference, but it gets to some point where they can't split the difference, and several things happen. I haven't put all these in. I've showed these here before. Either the group basically decides to go to one or the other, or it splits, or in some circumstances it goes back and forth because this is a stochastic model, and when the group gets up here, all of the vectors that point towards here are no longer pointing in the same direction, and so the group is driven down here. So we've looked at this analytically, approximating it initially by something called the Kuramoto model. This is work with Naomi Leonard and Ian Cousin and our students. And so you have 3 groups. You have those who want to go here, you have those who want to go here, and then the rest are uninformed. And so the fact they want to go here means, and we're just looking at their headings, there's no spatial model here. Those who want to go here, this function will drive them in the direction of theta 1 bar. This will drive them in the direction of theta 2 bar. And then there's a term, and this is all-to-all coupling, but we've looked at different topologies, in which each individual averages the directions of, or how different their direction is from the directions of all other individuals. And so there's a trade-off between these 2 things. So here we're just looking at the dynamics. And what happens in this is, you can see in this picture, here there were 5, I think, individuals who wanted to go here, 5 of them wanted to go here. The thing to see here is they organized themselves into groups. Now we got 3 clusters, and ultimately now the clusters interact. And in fact, we can show this mathematically. There are 2 time scales. On the fast time scale, individuals organize themselves into clusters with average orientation C1, C2, and C3. These are the individuals who wanted to go to 1, those to 2, and the others the uninformed. And then on the slower time scale, you can write out the dynamics of the system and do all sorts of bifurcation theory and study what's going on and get and reproduce a lot of the behavior we saw. But the conclusions I want to emphasize here to lead into the last part of the lecture is that naive individuals, that is uninformed or unopinionated individuals, turn out to be crucial to consensus. And non-spatial models like these do miss a lot of the key details. So we try and get around this, but basically multi-scale analyses are needed. So now for the last part, which is the importance of unopinionated or uninformed individuals and why they're important for consensus. And this is work that we just, well, before I tell you about the work we published in Science, this is a paper we had that came out about the same week in PNAS, in which we modified the scheme of Kuramoto, allowing the strengths of connections as to who you interact with to increase or decrease based on how close you are. So as individuals get together in groups, they strengthen those connections. That's what's in this model, and we looked at the role of uninformed individuals. Now, why are uninformed individuals important? Well, they create a momentum that shifts things back and forth. And you know, there's a lot of work on this recently in a lot of different contexts, and in terms of investors, in terms of the wisdom of crowds, et cetera. And that's basically what this is about. So this is the paper that we just published a little more than a month ago in Science. That many political scientists object to, but I think because of a misreading of what we say. So we are not saying that it's good that uninformed individuals can increase what we show here is that uninformed individuals can increase the chance that the majority opinion will hold, even if the minority is much more outspoken and holds their opinions more strongly. So some of the objections we get were, well, what about civil rights? It was good. The minorities, minority opinions should have a chance. Well, that's just an argument against, in this case, against democracy. This is just an observation that uninformed individuals make it more difficult for good or bad for minority groups' opinions to hold. So remember this is the split, and so if we have equal numbers of individuals with equal strengths of opinions, then the group will either split or go one way or the other with equal probability. But as soon as we change the number of leaders to say 6 and 5 even, then the group almost always goes in the direction in which the majority holds. But this changes if the minority, we didn't do in that paper, if the minority have an omega that's different. In other words, suppose there's a minority that want to go in this direction, but they really feel that much more strongly than the others. What happens then? So this is what we call the two-target model. And this is the simplest case. No uninformed individuals. Just some individuals want to go here and some here, 6 and 5. This is omega 2, the minority opinion over the majority, omega 2 over omega 1. If that's 1, if they both feel it the same, then you almost always go, this is the probability of reaching the majority target, you almost always go to the majority target. But as you increase omega 2 over omega 1, you shift things so that the minority opinion begins to dominate rather dramatically. If it's strong enough, you never end up at the majority viewpoint. Okay, but now what happens if you add in uninformed, naive individuals into this mix? Well, this is what shows you what happens. We still have 6 who want to go one direction, 5 the other, and we increase the number of uninformed individuals. And here are the weightings we chose were 0.3 and 0.38. The probability of reaching the majority target increases as the number of uninformed individuals Jacob, I think of this similar to stochastic resonance, actually, because it's driving things towards a different basin of attraction as you increase a kind of diffusion or noise in the system. So that increases for a while, and then eventually that can't go on, because if everybody is uninformed, then you're in a 50-50 thing. So it goes up for a while, and then it goes down. If I change that to 0.3, 0.4, it's a little higher. I'm sorry, a little lower is what I meant, because the minority opinion drags it down. 0.3, 0.42, even more. If I change, it's robust to this. If I change this to 4 and 3, 6 and 5, we can't do it too easily with a lot of individuals. We get the same pattern. It goes up rather sharply, and then it goes down. But from 0, increasing the number of uninformed individuals increases the potential for consensus. If you increase the distance between the two targets, that exaggerates this effect. And so this is the same thing, but with the targets further apart. It goes up rather sharply. So we wanted to know, oh, and the other thing that's going on here is, and this is for many more individuals, and 20 want to go this direction, something more than 20 want to go in the other direction. We can map this out. There's a region where the majority opinion dominates, there's a region where the minority dominates, and then there's this sort of fuzzy region in between. Because these are discrete, the distinctions here are discrete. So we wanted to know how general this is, namely the consensus that uninformed individuals, by washing out the influence of opinion strength, enforce fair representation, whether you like the outcome or not. And uninformed individuals inhibit the influence of a strongly opinionated minority by returning control to the numerical majority. So because we wanted to know, is this a general result, we looked at a number of models. Now, this doesn't prove anything. The first model is something called the adaptive network model. So we have a large number of nodes now. And we initialize this graph as an Erdős-Rényi graph, and essentially a random graph with mean degree at 10. That means every individual is initially connected to 10 other individuals. We're going to allow that to change. So all of these individuals have some preference as to which direction to go, but they may be stuck in an opinion or moving in a certain direction that doesn't match what their preferences are. So we allow all this to change. The focal individual changes his opinion with probability C for every individual that it's attached to, and that's only half the story. We make it more nonlinear because this is essentially just another way of saying it's nonlinear dependence on the number of neighbors. For every pair of individuals you're connected to with the opposite opinion, there's an increased probability of switching. So there's a probability of switching your opinion. And there's a randomness in here, so every individual spontaneously can switch states. But you're more likely to switch to what your preferred state should be. That's what this says here. And finally, links are made or broken with probabilities, with different probabilities that's based on the similarities of opinion. So we can write a mathematical approximation to this that confirms this, but basically the outcome is we get something that looks very similar. This is a log scale, so this is sharper than it would have looked previously. But still, the idea is as you increase the uninformed population, the probability of selecting the majority opinion in this model suddenly goes up. And in the approximation that we look at, we see the reasons for that is there's a saddle node bifurcation. As you increase the number of uninformed individuals, a second equilibrium bounces in here. And you can knock the system up to the other one so we can do the same sort of transition diagram. So we understand to some extent why this is happening. But we wanted to look at another model. Some of you 2 weeks ago heard Peyton Young talk here. Some of you have heard him talk many times, being his student here. And Peyton had a model some years ago on currencies. Everybody carries a certain currency. That's money for those. And you can only trade with individuals who have the same kind of currency that you have. At each time step, an individual selected at random with a certain probability, it switches to the currency held by the majority of individuals. And with some other random probability C, it switches to a random currency. Well, that's Peyton's model, but we've modified it, first of all, to make it more local, because instead of interacting with everybody, you only interact with some local sample. But more interestingly, you have a preference, an individual preference, and that means you're less likely to switch to a non-preferred state. And so it's somewhere between the adaptive network model and the spatial model. And again, we look at the dynamics of this, looks almost exactly the same. It doesn't have the sharp drop-off, that's not the interesting part to us, but it demonstrates as you increase the number of uninformed individuals, the probability of ending up with the majority goes up. And finally, we, which means Ian and his lab, tested this out on those golden shiners I showed you before. He trained a number of individuals to a blue target, to a yellow target, and then he put them in various situations to see how the number of uninformed individuals influence, and train some of them so they're more strongly attracted. And again, the theory says it ought to go up with the number of uninformed individuals, and these are the data which match pretty well with the theory from the original model. And my student, Ariana Strandberg-Peshkin, who's working with, actually she's Ian's student working secondarily with me, just sent me this wonderful video of where she is now. So these are, individuals are labeled here by being informed or not. And in this particular one, she drew lines to the 5 nearest neighbors, followed them dynamically, and the idea ultimately is to use this sort of analysis to see exactly what cues, how individuals are influenced by 1 neighbor, 2 neighbors, etc. So let me draw some conclusions out of this. Regarding leadership, leadership and following can coexist. See this in evolutionary models and all these other models. The leader, remember, is providing a public good. So these are public goods problems. What happens in the presence of conflicting leader opinions? Well, then multiple outcomes are possible. Crucially, unopinionated individuals can enhance consensus in favor of the majority opinion. Now, in case there are political scientists in the audience, I know it's a long way from golden shiners to humans. This is Haeckel's evolutionary tree coming back from the age of invertebrates. These are the age of fishes. These are fishes up here, and they're man. We are not golden shiners, most of us. And mathematical models necessarily leave out a lot of critical details and of course, simplify. So I realize one can't put too much weight on any model or on any set of experiments, which is after all a model on particular classes of organisms. Still, I think the weight of this independent evidence is at least suggestive that we need to pay a lot of attention to the role of uninformed individuals in consensus formation. And finally, just conclusions for the talk, going back to the beginning, there are various stages, I think, in the formation of norms and religions, etc. The initial stage of which is just aggregation and separation that can arise endogenously from random interactions and random movement, like in Schelling's model. But once the aggregates are there, they become a pre-pattern for selection, for fitness-enhancing behaviors, for isolation mechanisms, and for cooperative behaviors. Consensus and collective decision-making that I've been talking about at the end here can reinforce the group formation, and they then provide, as we heard in a lot of discussion this morning, the context for norms and religions and other institutions to arise. So thank you very much for your attention.
We have time for a few questions, and then I have a couple announcements.
Yes, Sturgis.
Now, in this model, the leader follower model, it's only preferential parameters. You have 2 informed leaders, say, we have different preferences, and that's the followers don't care very much, but they care more about being with the winner in some ways. Now, what about case?
Well, no, they're just following, and
that's
well, I mean, a different model.
But what if one of the there is, I mean, this is about sort of pure preferences, but what about if there is a truth, all right? But you're talking about the economy, whether this policy is better than the other policy, and you have leaders and followers, then how would, do you have anything on that?
Well, I'd be interested in discussion. To explore that, I'm not sure how that would enter. I mean, this model doesn't assume everybody's wrong. It assumes that the opinions and the beliefs as to where, so in the case of the fish, they're actually trained to the target, although we can trick them.
One source of food is much better than the other one.
Right, but that may change. I mean, it may no longer be the right information. In fact, it wasn't in the last thing I showed you, because although they've been changed to targets, when I showed them moving around, there wasn't any reward. They were just going to those targets anyway. They had been pre-trained to those targets. So this is where Group A believes is truth. This is where Group B believes is truth. And the other group in this has no idea what truth is, and they're just following along with everybody else. The degree to which this is correlated with what the true answers are is sort of independent of this model. But I mean, how would you work that into?
You would have some payoffs.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's right. So putting payoffs into it would be a very neat next thing to do. And we've done that in a sense in some of the models. In the stuff that I've been, certainly in those two papers from PNAS that I told you about, that's basically what we do, because our fitness function is how fast you get to to the target. And implicit in that is the notion that that target is the right one to go to. Faster you get there, get the higher fitness. And Naomi and Ian and I have a grant, Naomi Leonard and Ian Cousin and I have a grant, in which one of the things we do is to say we are going to, as a spatially and temporally fluctuating process, drop bits of food around, and individuals get a reward by how much food they accumulate. So we're going to look at the trade-off between leading and following, or information gain and following, based on how well you get to the food, and that your fitness is raised. So we've done that a little bit. That's not in these consensus formation models at the end, but that would be a natural extension, right? Yeah, Herb.
I understand with schools of fish and swarms of flocks of birds, the birds they're participating because they get something out of it if they go to the right place. But
they're participating, just a footnote on that, because evolutionarily there's been a reward for that engaging that kind of behavior.
But it has there's some logic to it. There's some rational understanding of why one would want to make a choice in one direction or another. But take the case of humans in a large democracy concerning any political issue at all. No individual can make a difference. If you're totally instrumental, you would never even bother getting an opinion on anything, and you certainly would never vote. So the behavioral basis for this very strong idea that we all want to know what the idea is, we all want to have the right opinion, and we think it matters, even though in any objective sense, nothing matters. It does not matter whether I believe X or Y, whether I vote or I don't.
Unless you're in Iowa.
No, it doesn't even matter in Iowa. You need 100 votes. One person doesn't ever matter.
Well,
so there's something in addition for humans.
It was 34 votes.
34 isn't one.
No, I know.
Okay,
but there are cases.
It's not even close to one. All I'm saying is,
no, I agree with you basically.
We should think about this thing of why humans care so much about these issues, when in fact it's not an instrumental question.
No, I think that's, I mean, first of all, I agree it's a much more complicated question. I know you, and Errol Oxay here wrote a paper on other regarding behaviors, and I know you and Sam have too, and I think that's a much deeper question. Yeah. I agree, but that gets structured on top of this, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I absolutely agree. Understanding why individuals can, well, why individuals contribute to public goods in general. I mean, the voting is a way of contributing to a public good. So that's a separate talk.
But there's another side to it, which is assuming that
Mhm.
if you do participate, it's not because of some instrumental reason. And
Right.
therefore, why would you ever possibly believe that the choices you would make would be self-serving?
Well,
In other words,
oh, well, they're self-serving
if
the
you're gonna be
following.
doing this anyway, why would you do like vote your
Ostracism.
wallet or something?
I mean, ostracism and feeling good about yourself. You know, I go and vote, which is a big pain in the neck in Princeton. You have to go across town. But if I don't, I feel guilty. You know, so
I wouldn't let you come home.
right.
You lie. You don't have to tell us.
So we
What you do is I voted. Oh, sure, I saw you in the bar.
no, but I'd have to tell that. I'd have to tell it to myself. You see, because it's become internalized. That these are just
conscience make
Hmm?
cowards of us all.
yeah. No, yes, yeah.
So along the lines of voting, accepting that a large number of uninformed individuals is good for arousing a consensus.
Mm-hmm. It's good for pushing consensus towards the majority opinion.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Why is it then in any election on voting on virtually any issue, I think that we also accept that it's mainly uninformed individuals, that almost all the time it's 50-50 plus or minus 5%. That 57% on any issue is a landslide. Is
Well-
it just because of the lack of a strong negative term?
First of all, we have political scientists here who can answer that better than I can, but one of the things you notice, and you see this in the Republican Party recently very strongly, is how fast the momentum can shift of the unopinionated. They wouldn't like to be called uninformed, but the independents, right, who shift back and forth very rapidly. There are other mechanisms that are operating I think at the broader level to favor the minority point of view, but I'd rather, maybe there's a political scientist here who can explain why. Something like Duverger's law.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing you have is that when you have elections by their very nature sort of like take away, have the effect that your mechanism has, and that, you know, it doesn't matter how intense you are, you're just counting numbers. So elections already sort of do what your mechanism explains. As a political scientist, what's really exciting is sort of like you're explaining sort of like changes in public opinion. You know, you have why it is we can have lots of uninformed voters who don't know much about issues. Nevertheless, when you look at sort of like survey research, you can find sort of like shifts to the right, shifts to the left. They happen systematically. You get these sort of these patterns. People behave as if they're at a macro level, as if they're ideological, even though we know at the micro level they're not. And this kind of mechanism seems to, you know, we one mechanism that maybe could explain that.
Yeah, it seemed to me, naively, that one of the reasons this happens is as your political group gets larger and larger, your influence in guiding it becomes less and less. And this gives you a reason to move off in the other direction. And we see some of that with the fish. So, for example, although if I'm a Democrat and my party has 48% of the voters, I would be much happier if they had 52%. But I wouldn't be happier if they had 100%, because then I'd be back to having no influence at all, right? There was another.
In reality, sometimes the vocal minorities win, and win big. Like,
Yeah, well, I mean that comes out in these models too. The vocal minorities can win if they hold their opinion strong enough, and if they're. And by the way, let me add to this that all of this except for the adaptive network model is essentially a well-mixed model. The fish model has a local aspect to it. But if you did all of these models on a grid, for example, then what you'd be dealing is small populations locally, and that would make it much easier for the minority groups to get started and spread out. This is, Brian, what we, and from Natasha, what you were talking about the other day, that's why I knew the answer to that. In the spatially distributed model, it's much easier for those groups to get a head start. So, but there's nothing, I mean, this doesn't say the minority groups can't win. It just says the more you dilute them, the harder it is for them to win. And the advantage of the spatial model is you dilute them less because you're only diluting them locally. Yeah.
Related to that point, being Malmix, I mean, even in the Malmix model, you're still interacting with a finite number of people, right, in all of these models. So
Yeah, that's true.
yeah, so a difference in
But a larger.
Well, a difference in explaining the political sort of developments in elections and so on. There's the mass media and the fact that vocal minority, if it has enough money and it feels strongly enough,
Yeah.
to buy a lot of ads.
Well, I mean, obviously, if you want to apply this to things that have a high political value, then you need a much more complicated scheme that's influenced by money and structure and the asymmetry of power. But I'm thinking about this in terms of things which have a little less political impact, have a lot. But Jeff Sachs, the economist, came and gave a talk at Princeton about 4 years ago, in which he was talking about climate change, and he reported, which was true, that at least in the U.S., public opinion had shifted much more towards accepting that global change was a problem. That was human-induced, and we had to do something about it. Then came the financial crisis, and all that disappeared, and the opinions shifted. Other opinions got more important. So on things in which, and obviously that's an issue where people are putting a lot of money in too, but not in the same political sense. Yeah.
So I have a question about how you're Malmix in revolution. Because with the revolution, it doesn't become a majority. It often starts as a vocal minority, overcoming at times an extreme population of people who maybe are perceived as thinking differently than they are, but they actually end up winning the group. So I'm
Well, I think that depends. I mean, it goes back to the spatial model. I think the way those movements succeed depends a great deal on localization. Because if you can establish a beachhead in a small local population, you'd get washed out if you tried to do that right with a large group right at the beginning. But if you establish a beachhead locally, then you can spread out and contagiously spread. So that would be my hypothesis, is that to get over this influence, you have to operate very locally and maybe furtively.
I think I understand the basic point about the effect of these uninformed populations increasing the likelihood that the majority wins. Is there a normative side to this argument? That is the result better? Let me take it out of the human realm back into species. Would one expect evolution to produce an environment in which you had uninformed or unopinionated members of these species and relatively limited numbers that had intense views? Would there be reason to believe that outcome would produce fitness or better?
Well, first of all, this is not being critical, but the way you ask that question is sort of a group selective approach. And the point I was making is that's, for the most part, that's not the way group selection is going to work. There may be some societies in which that are strongly structured enough that there be a component of that. So the question is, whatever the mechanisms by which evolution works, does this optimize behavior? And to me, it seems to me there's no reason to expect that it would necessarily optimize behavior from the collective point of view, but presumably it is the behaviors that have evolved have optimized individual payoffs within the game theoretic setting. Now, it's a great question to ask, how do we, and the experiments with fish are designed to look at some of the, how do individuals respond to neighbors? Is this going to increase the likelihood of a minority that happens to have the real information winning out? I mean, or is it going to minimize the probability? I don't know the answer to that. We haven't really looked at that. I'd have to think about even how to look at that question. But the important point, I think, is that it's a game theoretic situation.
Why don't we call that quits for this?
Can we just take the last question? Yeah, just that's
Okay. One of the models remind me of a Keynesian beauty contest. I think that's what it says.
Yeah, I wanted to hear that question.
You question.
Yeah, I did.
You know, your payoff depends on how close you are to the truth, your opinions to the truth.
Uh-huh.
That's sort of what research is getting at, but also how close your opinion is to other people's opinions. And I wonder if you could construct a financial market from golden shiners, in the sense that economists, these interactions with different groups and different leaders in financial markets may matter. So uninformed traders, for example, make trades work because it relaxes no trade theorems and so forth. But at the same time, economists had previously thought that when they moved Friedman in 1953, that when the price got above some kind of fundamental value, that you get these leaders, these arbitrageurs that would come in and bring price back down to the fundamental value. But then there are what we see is there is this competing class of leaders that try to inflate bubbles and take uninformed investors with them and try to play a timing game to take it to get out on the top. And I wonder if you can use these kinds of things to understand the competing effects of these kinds.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it gets more complicated if you've got people manipulating markets. So I mean, this is not the answer to everything, but I think it's a good platform to go on. Thanks very much.
Let's clap.